Good morning and welcome to this EPC webcast, a conversation on Trump versus Biden with an excellent interlocutor this morning, especially in view of this morning's news, where we heard, unfortunately, that President Trump and indeed, I think also his wife have both tested positive for COVID. We are lucky to have with us this morning Tony Gardner, who is probably well known to many of you, but I will briefly recall his CV. He's currently a managing partner with Brookfield's private equity group. He's a senior advisor at the Brunswick Group and a senior counsel at Siddeley Austin, among other things. Known to many of us as the US ambassador to the European Union from 2014 to 2017, and he played a very important role in the negotiations on TTIP and Privacy Shield. And he was also very instrumental in trying to give greater rights to European citizens of redress in federal courts. He's also the author, and I'm sure we'll talk about that this morning, of an excellent book on transatlantic relations called Stars with Stripes, The Essential Partnership Between the European Union and the United States. This morning, we're going to talk about the election, about the prospects for the implications for transatlantic relations. You have the possibility to ask questions. For those of you who are new to the EPC webinar format, you have two possibilities. You can write a written question in the question box on the control panel, or you can put your hand up to be given the opportunity to ask a question live, in which case you will be unmuted by Natalie, who's in charge of the technology this morning, and you'll be able to put your question directly to Tony. So that's, I think, all the housekeeping dealt with. Sorry, I should have introduced myself, David O'Sullivan. I'm the chairman of the governing board of the EPC. And also a former ambassador, but of the EU to the US. Though Tony and myself sometimes thought we could occasionally have swapped roles. Isn't that right, Tony? I think we spoke a lot during those days when we were both in our respective posts. Tony, let me start with a kind of very, I think, good question. You were one of the, in my memory, one of the very first people who kind of said, "I'm for Joe Biden as the Democratic candidate." And you turned out to be absolutely right. What made you so convinced that he was the best choice for the Democratic Party to run against President Trump?
Well, thank you, David. I hope that my sound is okay. Please interrupt me when it's not. It was great to work with you when we were still too, obviously, but we were on the phone every 2 weeks. We cooperated on many difficult files, and I really appreciate all the help and advice, wisdom over my tenure in Brussels. And thank you to the EPC. I'm very proud to be a member of their advisory board, and I think the EPC does terrific work. Before I answer that question, David, can I start with a quote which I read recently from Walter Isaacson's biography of Albert Einstein. It's a great read. And he says that he describes Einstein, and he says he had finally discovered what was fundamental about America. It can be swept by waves of what may seem to outsiders to be dangerous political passions, but are instead passing sentiments that are absorbed by its democracy and righted by its constitutional gyroscope. Einstein wrote a letter to his son, and this is a direct quote. He said, "Sometimes they, Americans, manage to return to normality. Everything, even lunacy, is mass-produced here, but everything goes out of fashion very quickly." It's very apropos, especially after the horrible images and sounds of that debate, which I hope will never be repeated in American history. I remain an optimist, David. You know me. If I weren't, I wouldn't have thrown myself into this election again. I was involved in 2 for Obama, and I supported Biden for several reasons, but one of them because I know him, I've known him, I've worked with him. He's a very decent person. And I thought the country needed to return to decency above all. Maybe that'll sound somewhat naive to some people on the call, but I think it's important And I think he was absolutely right to identify this election above all as a battle for the soul of the country. That's what we're talking about. And I don't think it is an exaggeration. It's a battle for the future of democracy in the United States. It's clearly a battle to save the fight against climate change, the fight to restore respect for all of us, but particularly for minorities and for women. There's so many things. So I thought he was the best standard bearer of that movement. And I thought he could win. A lot of people thought I was naive, David, and here I'll end, going on too long. I thought he could win because from a blue collar working background, he actually understands what it means in America, why people are frustrated in terms of their stagnant wages, why they feel the system is left them behind. Donald Trump speaks those words, but in fact, his policy prescriptions make all of those phenomena worse. So I thought he could win. I thought he's a decent person. I know his team. I know his foreign policy team very well. I think we'll go back. We're working hard. Last thing I'll say, last 6 months, we have policies on a lot of issues. We can get a lot of good stuff done. Mute. I think you're on mute.
Yes, sorry.
All right.
So you mentioned the debate, and I think I must admit I didn't stay up to watch it. I suspected it might it might not be a very edifying event, and indeed so it turned out. I think a lot of people were fairly shocked by what they saw. But how do you think the campaign is going more generally? And of course now we do have this surprise announcement or news about the president and his wife, which is obviously going to impact on the campaign. But maybe we'll come back to that in a few minutes. But what's your sense of how the campaign is going at this point?
Well, you know, I'm sitting in London, so I'm removed from the day-to-day. But look, I remain cautiously optimistic. I've been cautiously optimistic for actually months now. It doesn't mean that I think this is I've always thought this is about a 60-40 in our favor election. He's capable of doing anything, clearly, and he will do anything. He said it during the debate. I mean, he's put the extreme right on standby. He probably will ask people to go on the streets, and worse, and you know, perhaps there'll be some violence. I hope not. There will be lots of lawsuits, and it may end up in a Supreme Court that now is controlled by the conservatives. But I remain optimistic, and the trends have been pretty stable. I think everyone's seen the polling. You know, I'm very cautious about polling because we've seen this movie before. I was assured in 2016, don't worry, you know, don't sweat it, it's going to be fine. But this is a different election. You know, the lessons have been absorbed, they've been learned. I speak to a lot of members of the Biden campaign or the nitty-gritty, and believe me, they have not for a second taken any of the swing states for granted. They spent a lot of time there, spending a lot of money there, a lot of people on the ground there. So nothing is being taken for granted. So I don't think we're going to commit the same errors. And Joe Biden doesn't have the baggage of Hillary Clinton. So I remain optimistic.
Yes, I mean, you've partially answered what I might have put as the next question, because indeed, I think Biden does have a fairly substantial lead nationally, though, as we know, national polls don't tell you a lot because the electoral system in the US is ultimately, it's more like 50 separate state elections than it is like a national election in terms of with the Electoral College and so forth. But even in the swing states, in some of the key swing states, he does appear to have a good lead. But you know, I think a number of us, like yourself, are somewhat cautious about relying on the polls and the risk that there could be a surprise. Do you, if there were to be a surprise, where do you think it would come from? I mean, or do you, if you were Trump now, what is his strategy? He's behind. In the debate, he seemed to just double down on his kind of standard, you know, operating mode. He doesn't seem to be making any attempt to reach out to middle ground voters. And one of the things that struck me was that often people in polls, I suspect people don't always like to admit that they vote for Trump, but they do it in the privacy of the election, the voting booth. So what do you think is President Trump's strategy in coming from behind at this point? How can he win this back?
Well, I think we've seen the playbook. It's pretty clear. You know, it's law and order. I'm the law and order president. The other guy is the chaos, anarchy, and left-wing crazy commie, you know, order. He's a front guy. Joe Biden looks okay, looks like a good, nice, friendly uncle, but behind him stand some wild-eyed radicals, and you don't want to put the country in the hands of wild-eyed radicals who want to defund our police, right? So that's the playbook, and the playbook is look at that elephant in the room, anything that's not COVID. Let's not talk about 210,000 Americans who died, many of whom unnecessarily. Let's talk about other stuff. So the playbook is well known. You know, in terms of the debate, one can speculate at length as to whether or not he achieved his objectives. As you say, if his objective was to convince some independents, moderates, he failed. If his objective was to make Biden seem like a lefty, he failed. If the objective was to make Biden seem soft on crime, he failed. But if his objective is very different, to embolden his base, his hardcore, he succeeded. If it was to make moderates tune out, and not go to the polls, he succeeded. And this is the most important thing. If his objective was to sow the seeds for a run after 4 years, because I think he believes he's going to lose this election. If his intention was to sow the seeds of a narrative, he has succeeded. And I think him catching COVID actually feeds into that narrative. I lost because I was sick. I lost because the election was a fraud. It was taken away from me. I lost because of all these post-in ballots, many of which come late, and many of which were invalid. And I lost for a whole bunch of other reasons. I think, I'm obviously speculating, but I think this is a very important strategy for him to prepare a run in 4 years' time.
Okay, well, I'd like to come on to the implications of all this for transatlantic relations. But before I do, I just one more question maybe about the election, because I know it's much talked about, certainly here in Brussels. Anyone I meet mentions this. You mentioned it as well. I mean, if President Trump says, I didn't lose, it was a rigged election. What happens if we have a contested election? And I must say, I don't know whether anyone, whether you picked up on it, but there's in the November edition of the Atlantic magazine, which is out now, as in the way of these things, they devote quite a lot of attention to this. There's a very excellent but rather depressing article about how you could have a complete kind of paralysis if there is really a doubt cast over the validity of the election. Do you think the American Constitution is robust enough to stand up to a serious attempt by an incumbent to sort of basically say, I haven't lost and I'm not leaving?
Well, Dave, you know, I read extracts from that. I've read a few other things that talk about different scenarios, and some of them relate to the so-called faithless electors. You know, each state has different rules about the members of the Electoral College and whether they need to have to follow the vote of their state. It's a pretty extreme scenario whereby, and the scenario here, just to remind everyone, is that you could have battling members of particular states, electors, and going and saying that we cast our vote in different ways, and then there's a stalemate, and then it would have to, there could be an interim government, which could be Nancy Pelosi, as I understand, as the Speaker of the House. This is pretty extreme stuff. I really I'd like to believe that we're not going to go there, but I'm not an expert. I just can't opine on it.
Well, I think we all hope that there's a clear outcome, and so let us then imagine that Vice President Biden wins. What is that going to mean for transatlantic relations? What do you think would change? And then maybe we could just go through some of the different areas where there are tensions in the relationship. And some of that, of course, is due to the personality of President Trump. But as we both know, some of it is also due to structural differences between Europe and the United States, which have not really been properly addressed, probably in the last couple of years. So, what's your sense of what we as Europeans, what should we expect from a new Biden administration, apart from an obvious change of tone and style?
Well, I'd like to hear your views about that. But look, there's so much to be said. That's the topic of my book, in a word. What we have been doing together, U.S. and Europe, particularly the EU, over 60 years, what we could be doing together in the future. The important point here is that Donald Trump jumped the rails. His administration has departed from 60 years of established bipartisan foreign policy on the EU for not only no good reason, but for reasons that are counterproductive and show a fundamental misreading of Europe and the EU. Look, there's so much to be said, but to try to encapsulate it, in my view, this president thinks that in the triangle of relationships, US-UK, UK-EU, US-EU, the only side of that triangle that matters, David, is US-UK, period. And that US-EU doesn't matter and UK-EU is none of our business. That's just misreading. Under a Biden administration, I think we'll see that a view that EU is an essential partner, as I call it in my book, that all three sides of that triangle have to work effectively. And as I mentioned briefly, we have policy papers on what the administration should be doing in the first day, first 100 days, first year. And by the way, I should say, obviously, I don't speak for the administration here. This is just me. But having been involved in some of these working groups and contributing some thoughts, there's a lot that we can do right away, very quickly. I really believe this. And just two important things, David. When we are working in these groups, and they're now, just in my group, there are 35 people, so there are hundreds of people working in different groups. There are two thoughts that shape and form our work. The first is, what can we do quickly and pragmatically in, let's say, a year and a half before the midterms that makes a difference? And secondly, and I think this is really important in foreign policy, how do we craft a foreign policy for the middle class, particularly in trade? How can we show that following rules and working with allies produces better results than undermining allies, insulting allies, breaking rules and institutions, and negotiating only bilaterally and transactionally, for example, with China? That's going to be so important, because if we fail in that critical mission, I believe we will face in 4 years, if Biden wins, an even more virulent form of populism. So that is the context in which we're trying to focus on our policy proposals, of which there are many.
Yeah, no, that's very helpful, and I can imagine that the Biden team is very well prepared. What I'd like to do, Tony, is maybe we can break it down into a couple of areas of policy and explore in a little bit more detail what are the changes, and what I'm particularly interested in, I must say, from my perspective, is I don't think it's going. I think many people in Europe are assuming that if Mr. Biden becomes president, that it's almost a sort of immediate return to the status quo ante, and that everything's back to the way it was, and then we'd have our disagreements, but everything we'll all get along. I think that there are structural problems in the relationship which run quite deep, and which President Biden a future President Biden will also struggle to deal with, and I expect, or I imagine, that there will be certain expectations of the administration. It won't be just that we in Europe will find a more congenial interlocutor, but I think the administration will also have asks of the EU and the Europeans. And the question is, how are we going to bring those together? So maybe could we start with security defense, which is obviously I imagine a strong defense of NATO. But it's been a long American criticism with, I think, justification that we Europeans don't shoulder enough of our own responsibility. On the other hand, sometimes the feeling in Europe is that it's just about buying more American military equipment and not really about making European defense capability more efficient and more effective. What do you think would be the positioning, and recognize that you're not speaking, of course, on behalf of the candidate, but that you're just basing it on your understanding and some of the stuff that you touched on in your excellent book. What do you think would be the approach, say, vis-a-vis to the idea of greater European cooperation in the area of security and defense?
Well, I think it would be more open. You know, I certainly take that view, as you know. It's not just about buying more of our kit. And even during the Clinton White House, I was unfortunately a witness to too many meetings in which the talking point was, please buy more of our whatever it was, you know, airplanes. And at one very interesting moment, I think it was Susanna Agnelli, who was then Foreign Minister of Italy, says, you know, this relationship is more than just us buying your aircraft. And she said, I think, to Tony Lake, and she was right. So we should walk the walk and talk the talk. In my view, and I think it's shared by others who will probably play an important role in this administration, that if we are serious, Europe should play a role as partner and step up, not only by spending more, but by spending correctly and wisely on kit, not just on pensions and salaries, but on all the things you mentioned, on common platforms, on common procurement, and on systems which are not just bought from the United States. I think there would be more openness. I think a lot more openness to NATO-EU cooperation. We made good progress, as you remember, David, during our time. I think there's a lot more that can be done. I'll say this. You know, this burden sharing issue has been going on for decades now, and is sometimes a bit, you know, repetitive. I think the view should be, yes, it's absolutely right that Germany should be spending more. It's obvious, right, and should be spending more faster. But in my view, burden sharing should be seen in a much broader light. It's not just about military. It's about what we do on climate. It's what we do on migration. There are a lot of major burdens that we need to bear together. And I should say, and I think there will be others who believe, that Europe is bearing more of those burdens than the United States. It's singularly failing to meet the burden of defense, and that's pretty shameful, but it is bearing the burden on climate and on migration. You know, on troops withdrawal from Germany, I think there would be, I suspect there would be an immediate re-look at this. It's a political move. It's not a move that's based on military analysis. Many of the top brass have agreed, saying that we should keep our troops in Germany and not move them out. Sure, we can rotate troops in and out of Poland, but you know, to try to undermine a sitting chancellor out of a political pique because she doesn't play ball with Donald Trump is pretty shameful. So I think we'll see a lot of differences on military and security. And by the way, last thing I'll say on energy security, I think things will be done in a different way. I think there is similar views about, for example, the Nord Stream pipeline. We were not shy in speaking up about it during Obama, as you remember, but in a very different way. It's unacceptable to be haranguing, insulting allies, sending threatening letters to politicians and members, officials at ports and so forth. I think the view should be expressed that it's a divisive program. It's certainly a political, and not just political, economic, but certainly a political program. But the focus here is not just on Europe buying our liquefied natural gas, David. I mean, that's the real thrust of this administration, just buying more of our stuff. That's not European energy security. It's a much broader topic, and we have to go back to diversifications of routes and supplies and all those other issues, not just buying our LNG.
Yes, no, I thank you for broadening the context, because I do think you're right that when you talk about burden sharing and security, it's more than just about the military spend, important though that is, and I understand why America will expect more from Europe and the EU. Let's turn to another area which has been very controversial with President Trump, of course, which is the issue of trade. We've had the arguments about the deficit. You know my talking points. I know your talking points. We've had the arguments about the WTO. And I think probably that is one of the most urgent issues which is there. And we actually have a question, if I can find it now, got it, yes, from Maria Asenius, former chief of staff to Cecilia Malmström, asking would Biden be ready to help fix the WTO? And she reminds us that the blocking of new arbitrators to the appellate body did actually start already under President Obama. There are some real substantive issues there which probably divide the Europe and the US. But do you think we could get back on track to a more constructive discussion about how to fix the WTO?
Absolutely, yes. Hello, Maria. Great to, well, not see you, but to sort of hear you. Absolutely. Look, there's several papers written about this. We're working on it, and it's a very high priority. And I'm pretty optimistic that we could make progress. So the short answer is, clearly, I think it should be clear that we would lift the veto on the dispute settlement body. We make it a functioning body. Trump has tried to undermine it so that it doesn't work properly. So we lift the veto. And we have a whole set of recommendations on how to make the WTO more effective. The EU, as I think everyone on the call knows, has published on several occasions a very good white paper on WTO reform. I've been in touch with Ignacio, Garcia Becerro, who's done some terrific work on this. I think there's a lot of overlap. There's some good ideas, even in Lighthizer USTR paper. We're not going to agree on everything, but we're going to agree actually on quite a few things. It's not just the speed and not just the transparency. It's not just the way that rulings are made in terms of the whether judges are held to a clear framework for rulings, so they can't make what's called obiter dicta. They can't start making judgments on things that are not directly before them. There's a lot of overlap in terms of reforms that's needed in terms of subsidies and the role of state-owned enterprises, state-run capitalism, and so forth. So I'm hopeful that we can do it, and I think this is a really important point, because if I had to identify one area where the Trump administration's view on the EU are truly bizarre, it's the following. The view that the United States doesn't need the EU to deal with China or to deal with the WTO. It doesn't need to deal with the EU because it's worse than a distraction. It undermines the ability of the United States to get stuff done. I think that's completely wrong for obvious reasons, or at least obvious for everyone on the call. We can leverage our joint power because of our markets with regard to the Chinese, and I think for some reform, whether it's by, with regard to public procurement markets and saying that the Chinese, as the EU is now doing, you cannot have access to certain of our markets if you close your markets to ours. Let's use our leverage together and let's try to make the institution actually work properly. So I hope it happens. I think it will.
Thank you. I want to come back to China because I think it merits a sort of separate chapter in our discussion. But just sticking with the trade stuff. So the WTO, we could probably find a bit more common ground. What about the bilateral trade relations, Tony? I mean, the deficit is what it is, and you can argue the numbers. Deficit in goods, surplus to the U.S. in services, primary income from investment, and so forth. But we do know that there is a prevailing sense in a number of quarters in the US that the EU is not as open a market as they would like it to be. And I think this mainly focuses on agriculture, a little bit on standard setting and so forth. I don't think there's any great appetite to go back to TTIP, even if you and I would probably be able to agree that in theory it would be a good idea, but I don't think anyone's going to revive that idea anytime soon. how do you think the new administration would approach the issue of trade with the EU, and how to get us to a better place where both sides feel comfortable with our trading relationship and neither side feels unfairly disadvantaged?
Well, you said something that was so right a couple of moments ago, that we can't pretend that Donald Trump never existed. We can't roll back the clock to 1 minute before noon, January 20th, 2017. It's not going to happen. We're not going back to TTIP. And even worse than that, if Biden wins, the pressure will be so great to fix so much that's gone wrong domestically and in terms of foreign policy, that there will be, quite frankly, not much bandwidth to deal with trade, and not much appetite in Congress to deal with big trade agreements. I'm not even sure we're going to try to go back to TPP. But with Europe, there are some things we can get done. You also, and here again, David, we keep agreeing with each other. It's perhaps boring, but you said something which is so true and so often ignored. Donald Trump just talks about goods trade, which is typical, because he, of course, doesn't understand the first thing about trade. Goods trade is just part of the picture. The services trade, you mentioned income from foreign affiliates, and Dan Hamilton has been great on this point. In the round, our relationship is not quite as unbalanced as Donald Trump says it is, which is typical. He talks about car tariffs. He doesn't mention tariffs on vans, on trucks, which goes the other way, and et cetera, et cetera. Having said that, you're right. There is a lot of bitterness in the United States, but particularly about ag, which is indeed unbalanced. And it's, look, I fought this fight unsuccessfully, as you remember, because when you compare U.S. agricultural exports with the rest of the world, they've been rising very fast. And with Europe, they've been flat. I think they've been flat for a very, very long time. And that does need to change. But having said that, I would like to see a degree of realism, because this talking point ping pong doesn't get us anywhere. And we've both been, witnesses to talking point ping pong. There's no point in trying to force European consumers to eat foods that they don't want to eat. We can turn blue in the mouth about hormone treated beef and whatever these different washes for poultry and pork and so forth, whether it's chlorine or so forth, or growth promotants. My view is that, and this may not go down well, probably in Congress, I was considered to be maybe weak, but we're not going to force European consumers to change those habits. We should focus on areas that don't require fundamental different views of European habits and even culture. And GIs is a separate topic. There are things we can do on SBS, David, I think, which have been these festering, rather irritating things, which are not necessary. We both had, these lists on both sides of SBS, irritants for a long time. And, in my book, I describe how ridiculous some of them are, but I think we can make progress on some of them. And then we would have to do it, importantly, if we eliminate tariffs on industrial goods trade, which I think we could do very quickly, it would have to be accompanied by some movement on some of these agricultural issues. But we need to be realistic. Let's not fight these fights of the past. And I do think that Europe, separate from a trade agreement, has to do a better job in listening to its own agencies like EFSA, the Food Safety Agency, and actually implement its own laws.
I can certainly agree with that. Another area of conflict is the digital. Obviously, there's the issue of the digital tax, which is going to be quite controversial. But we've also had the data privacy issue. And we have a question here from Anne-Sophie Petitbois saying, following the Schrems II judgment, and considering that you, Tony, I was slightly involved as well, though, actually, negotiated the Privacy Shield, how do you see the future of EU-US data transfer under the next administration, if assuming a new one? Which I think is the hypothesis, the entire hypothesis of this conversation, by the way. Tony.
Yeah. Look, fascinating to look back on those years. We were struggling to negotiate this deal. And I think, David, you remember the details just as well as I do. You know, we knew that there was a risk. Of course we knew there's a risk. We were not willing to construct a bulletproof agreement. We're not willing to go there. Our intelligence services were not willing to go there. We did the best we could in the circumstances we were in. And here we are, and now we have Privacy Shield that's found invalid. This is not going to be simple, because when you read the judgment, as I think many people on the call have done, the focus is on issues that are going to be very difficult in terms of access of intelligence agencies to information and the rights of judicial redress of Europeans in US courts. And you're right, David, you mentioned something that I actually feel rather proud of. You know, it's modest, but still it took a big push, and that was in the umbrella agreement for law enforcement data exchange. I did push to introduce legislation, which was passed actually by a large majority, bipartisan basis, to give Europeans some additional rights to protect their rights before federal court. Everyone told me I would never succeed, right? Never ever succeed. John Podesta seemed to think you're kind of crazy, but we actually got it done. You know, some proponents in Europe, I won't mention who they are, think the answer to this conundrum of Privacy Shield is encryption. Let's just encrypt all data. And you can imagine there are not many great proponents or enthusiasts of that avenue. Some people in the EU, including the Commission, say, well, not only encryption, but we should just data localize everything, and we can solve the problem. Just let's ask all companies to house their data in Europe, so it's not transferred to the United States. And that also is not a very positive, prospect, because you lose a lot of the efficiencies of, data treatment and analysis in one place. There are tweaks that we can do, David. There are tweaks we can make to this agreement. And look, the ombudsperson at the State Department can be tweaked. The various other procedural things we can tweak, but to the basic point about treating European citizens the same way is what I read the judgment is saying as American citizens in terms of their rights. In fact, informing them they've been the subject of surveillance is something that's going to be not only hard, I just don't see how it can be done. And no other country in the world does this, or if there is, I certainly don't know about it. So the short answer is I don't know how we solve this problem, how we fix this agreement.
Yeah, I think I'm in the same position. By the way, I certainly acknowledge your personal Herculean efforts in the passage of the Judicial Redress Act, but we should also pay tribute to Jim Sensenbrenner, the congressman from Wisconsin, who really did a lot of the heavy lifting in Congress. And I actually have hanging on my wall here the photograph that was taken when President Obama signed that into effect, with indeed Congressman Sensenbrenner and other notable of the Obama administration at the time. Sticking with the digital, but moving on, turning to China, which I think is a very big issue, but just coming at it from the digital side of things. Paul Taylor has a question. I'm now trying to see if I can get this. Yes, what would a Biden administration expect of the EU relations on China? That's a more general one, but then he specifically says, would it be as aggressive in trying to drive out Huawei from European networks? And would it consider a European solution involving Ericsson and Nokia? So we'll deal with China more generally, but let's look at the digital side of things with China, and particularly the 5G issue. I imagine, sorry, putting words into your mouth, that Biden will be also fairly tough on China. I mean, he will share not the style, but quite a lot probably of the criticism of President Trump, which I think is fairly bipartisan in America. But how would he deal then with this vexed issue of the 5G, and in particular the extraterritorial reach of US sanctions, which really go very far into basically making it very difficult for Huawei to operate at all?
This is going to be a really, really difficult one, because we are, as everyone on the phone knows, we're living in a pretty extreme situation in the United States. all of us, or most of us, remember what life was like under the U.S.-Soviet, sort of the Cold War. Even then, there were hawks and there were doves. Now there are no doves on China. If there are, they're hiding. I mean, now there's almost unanimity in terms of the view that China is a risk, it's a problem, it's a challenge, it's a menace to our way of life, to our ability to maintain leadership or co-leadership in key areas of the economy. So on that, there's no disagreement. Biden, in many speeches, made very clear. This is not just campaign rhetoric, whereby he needs to be seen as being tough on China, but I think truly believes that China is a strategic competitor and is not playing by the rules, obviously, in world trade. The big difference, of course, is the tactics. The big difference is, has Donald Trump gone about this the right way? Has he gotten results? I mean, that's the acid test. Has Donald Trump's policies, have they resulted in tangible results that improve the position of the United States economically and politically? And there, the answer, I think, is resounding: absolutely not. Even by his own metric, which is a silly metric, the trade deficit, he's failed. But in many other metrics, he's failed to achieve what he wanted. So the tactics are different, and particularly, I would say, working with allies, working with the EU to reform the system. With regard to 5G, I have no idea, clearly. I haven't seen the paper. I'm sure there are several papers on this the campaign has done. But I'm pretty sure that the tactics there will not be to insult, to harangue our allies, to tell them what to do, to threaten them what to do. But to, if the view is, which probably I think it will be, there are high risks of including Huawei, apparently, from what I've read, not only in the core, but even the periphery of the infrastructure, that we need to come to a common view about how to deal with it over time. And in terms of Ericsson and Nokia, I mean, clearly that will be an interesting discussion. How do we build up substitutes to a Huawei that's built up an extremely important market position? Because we all need to roll out 5G infrastructure as fast as possible on a cost-efficient basis. I mean, that's the key thing. Huawei is a very cost-effective competitor. So those are the main differences, I think, David.
Well, that will certainly be, I think, a subject of great discussion. I think on China, the fundamental difference between, I think, the Europeans and the Americans is probably that we see China less as a sort of existential threat. Whereas, of course, I understand that for the US as the sort of global power, the only global power, that the rise of China poses some very serious threats to that role. On the other hand, I think it's very difficult to imagine a world in which we completely disconnect from China. It's too important, it's too big, it's going to be too influential. It already is extremely influential, for better or for worse. So I think the challenge will be to find the right blend of confrontation and challenging China where we disagree with their policies, whether that's human rights or the South China Sea or the trade aspects, and at the same time finding a way to bind them into the international community where we need their cooperation on foreign policy issues, take Iran, or where we need their cooperation on climate and other things. So getting that balance, I mean, I'm not sure myself exactly how you strike it, but I hope that we can have more constructive conversations with the Biden administration, a future Biden administration, than has been possible so far with this administration. Tony, what do you think, that's not what your country can do for you, what you can do for your country question. What do you think a future President Biden would want from Europe or would expect from Europe? I mean, we've talked optimistically about greater cooperation, about relationship with allies, maybe more respect in the relationship. But in my experience, and excuse me for speaking frankly, often American idea of coordination with Europe is to say, here's our position, wouldn't you like to agree to it? And then if we don't agree, it's why are you being so unhelpful? I mean, how can we, develop a dialogue that is actually a real dialogue in which we try to shape some common positions rather than, I sometimes think the difficulties in Washington is by the time you, which we have on the European side, by the time you develop a position, which is a sort of synthesis of different views, and then you bring it outside to talk to others, there's not a lot of flexibility for changing it. And we're guilty of the same thing in the EU. By the time we agree on something, then we bring it to others, we're kind of stuck that it's very difficult to modify it. So do you think there'll be an appetite for really working behind the scenes to try and build common positions which can work for both?
David, you're absolutely so right. Europeans have this pesky habit of not agreeing with our enlightened view of the world. And you should just roll over and say, yes, things would be so much simpler, right? But it doesn't work that way. You're so right. I want to go back just for a second on China, David. It's important here because I do sense a few things in the team. First, there isn't this Manichaean view, it's a deterministic view that has been written about in terms of the Thucydides trap. We're bound for conflict between a rising power and a declining power. There's no view about that the rise of China actually has been and is and will be a good thing for many people, and a great degree of admiration for the fact that China has lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. So all of that is true. And you mentioned something also very important on climate. This is a hugely important area. President Xi's recent statement is potentially very significant, goes beyond anything the Chinese have said in terms of their ambitions for climate change. That's an area of potential very significant cooperation. You're so right. We can't ask Europe to choose sides, and nor should we, nor I don't think will we, to say to the EU and Europe, it's our way or you're for the Chinese. It's either black or white, because that approach isn't going to work. But there are a lot of things that we can do, as I said, pragmatically in the short term. I hear a few. Look, COVID is a good example. We have a strategy paper, for example, what we could do with Europe, particularly with the EU, in terms of cooperating and coordinating our efforts in dealing with a pandemic, because it's going to be with us for a while. And there's so many interesting strands to this. One is travel. How do we make sure that travel lanes stay open, particularly across the Atlantic, through very digital health passes and otherwise, which is both, I've seen actually some of the beta testing for some of these products. We should do that. In terms of joint research, in terms of stockpiling, in terms of eliminating tariffs on particular goods, pharmaceuticals and protective equipment, and working together to make sure the third world has access to cheap medicines as well. So that's one area. It's a very pragmatic, very doable thing that we can do with Europe right away. It doesn't ask them to roll over. On Boeing and Airbus, David, something near and dear to your heart. Why shouldn't we be able to actually solve this festering trade dispute? On industrial goods tariffs, eminently possible to get this done. We did it in TTIP. We got there. We agreed elimination of 97% of all tariff lines, which were goods tariffs, not ag. So there are a lot of things. On WTO reform, we are going to differ for sure. And I think the attitude of this administration is, look, let's just find the areas where we can agree. Let's park the areas where we're just not going to agree. But we have a compressed period of time. We can't waste that time. And let's just move on those areas where we can agree. And I think the pressure is on, David. I mean, literally in the first 6 months, I think we should set up working groups on COVID, working groups on WTO reform, and plot a path for the first 2 years.
Well, I do agree with that. I mean, my own sense is that if there is a change of administration, those first couple of years may be the last chance to really reinvigorate the transatlantic relationship. I think we will have to show results. I agree. You've touched on a couple of questions which were there. You talked about the China climate issue, which was going to be a question from Matthias Piotrowski. and Yana Dyer from Borderlex wanted to talk about trade, which I think we've covered. I think John Kerr wants to put a question live. It's written. He said, I think he has a question. Natalie, can we unmute John Kerr if you can find that? John, are you there? Do you want to ask your question?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes. The technology works. It's good to hear from you. How are you? Please put your question.
My question is to Tony, as a good constitutional lawyer, Tony. What happens, please, constitutionally, if before the election Trump and Pence are incapacitated, or if after an election which Trump has won or says he's won, Trump and Pence are incapacitated before the inauguration? Simple question.
Yeah, no pressure there, Tony.
Oh my goodness. Oh, but this is foreseen in the Constitution. I should know exactly which clause, that if they are incapacitated, and I believe it's the cabinet that has to make a finding. I hope that's correct. They have to make a finding that both the president and the vice president are incapacitated, no longer of sound mind to exercise their functions. It passes, I believe, John, to the speaker. I hope I say that correctly. I'm not a constitutional expert, but I think it's the cabinet will have to make that decision. But there is a clear look. There's clearly foreseen in the Constitution of the chain of command.
Well, there's obviously going to be a lot of speculation about all of that in the next few weeks. And thank you for that question, John. Tony, we're kind of moving towards the end of the hour. Can you tell me what your advice would be to the EU if you were sitting with Ursula von der Leyen now, or with Charles Michel? What do you think the Europeans should be doing to prepare for a possible change of administration, recognizing that unfortunately we do have to have two plans, right? But what do you think? Since we both kind of agree, I think that if there is a change of administration, this is going to be a unique opportunity to really get this transatlantic relationship, which is so fundamental for both of us, back on track. What kind of initiative do you think, if any, do you think the Europeans should be taking, and what kind of efforts do you think they should be making to bring something to the table with the new administration?
Well, on a general basis, at the risk of repeating myself, we need to seize the day. If Biden wins, this will be one of the most pro-European, and dare I say it, even pro-EU administrations Europe will have seen. Probably even more so than Obama, because I served under Obama and I love him dearly and so forth. But there were also some skepticism about the EU during the Obama years. But Joe Biden, let's remember, he not only does he know Europe, he spoke. Remember, he spoke at the European Parliament in Strasbourg. He understands the EU. The people who will serve in high office, whether it's Tony Blinken or Nick Burns or others, believe the EU is an essential partner. Seize the day. We cannot waste time here. And if we win in November, and assuming, which is a big if, we have clarity about the results of the election, work should begin immediately on some of the areas that I mentioned. Where can we get real movement done? And I think the onus is on both of us, both sides, to say what is doable pragmatically, quickly on trade and on non-trade issues. And the issues where we frankly come to a conclusion is too hard, let's drop it. So, for example, stop whipping us about public procurement markets. It's just not going to work. I understand the EU's position, I understand the American position, but we come from this from two different ways. From Congress, it's not moving. We're not going to open up public procurement markets. We're not opening up the Jones Act. It's not going to happen. And some things in Europe are just not going to happen. So let's just bury the ghosts of the past, if I could put it that way, and focus on what we need to get done. A good example is this ISDS debate, which was a fruitless, stupid thing to be fighting each other over. We died in the trenches, over this peripheral issue. That's exactly what we need to avoid, David, in my view.
Well, amen to that. I can only, as always, Tony, it's probably a bit boring for the people watching us, but agree completely with what you've just said. I think we absolutely have to find ways of identifying areas where we can really demonstrate to our respective publics that this, this transatlantic relationship has real value and brings benefits to both sides. And I think you've already picked up on quite a lot of the areas, and it's really been a delight talking with you again. And thank you for taking the time and sharing your thoughts. And frankly, thank you for your deep commitment to this relationship. I know you also feel it from a family point of view, from your father, from your wife and family. But really, we greatly appreciate having friends, American friends, with such a deep commitment to the transatlantic relationship and also to the European Union. We haven't talked about Brexit. We haven't talked about the UK, because obviously that will be an issue as well, as to how we find ways of continuing to engage constructively with a UK which is no longer a member of the European Union, which can make life more complicated, but will not reduce the importance of also getting that relationship right in terms of the transatlantic relationship. So plenty of challenges there. So Tony, thank you very much indeed. Thank you to all our participants. I'm not entirely sure what the word is actually. Is it participants, viewers, anyway, audience? I don't know. A little bit of publicity. We'll be doing another event this afternoon, starting at 3 o'clock Brussels time, on the future transatlantic relations following the election, with a star cast of Bruce Stokes and Phil Gordon and Peter Rashid and Constance Stensenmiller. So that should be a really interesting discussion for those of you who take an interest in transatlantic relations. With that, Tony, I just thank you once again. Wish you well. Hope we can see each other personally at some point, which is less and less possible these days, unfortunately, with the pandemic and all the restrictions which it necessarily imposes on us. But I hope to catch up with you again on another occasion. And thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, David. Thank you, EPC. Bye-bye.
Okay. Thank you very much, everyone, and maybe see some of you this afternoon. Okay.